I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we are speaking to a great guest, D.D. Guttenplan of The Nation magazine, and author of American Radical, The Life of I.F. Stone. Before we get to that, though, I want to remind you that this show is entirely listener funded. So if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. With that out of the way, as I said, we have D.D. Guttenplan on the show to discuss the history of The Nation magazine, which is celebrating its 160th anniversary. And that history is really interesting. It was founded by abolitionists. We'll get into that in the conversation to follow. We'll also discuss the July issue of The Nation entitled These Disunited States. It's a very interesting issue. And of course, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about I.F. Stone, a truly radical journalist who, incidentally, worked at The Nation. And, I.F. Stone is an incredible character, a muckraker who exposed a lot of lies in his time, specifically during the Vietnam War especially. You'll hear all about that in the conversation to follow. A truly pioneering journalist. And Dee Dee's book on him, American Radical, is really worth a read. So with all that in mind, let's get right to it with D.D. Guttenplan. Welcome to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm really excited to be speaking with. I actually was telling him how I've read some of his previous work, particularly a book called American Radical, about the life and times of the great journalist I.F. Stone. So this is like a big get for me, as the kids would say. And I'm talking about D.D. Guttenplan, editor at The Nation, which is celebrating its 160th anniversary. How are you doing?
We're doing great, and it's great to be with you, JG. Yeah, the mood here is not necessarily entirely celebratory. After all, we're about to be dragged into another really deadly and stupid war. But in terms of having survived from 1865 to 2025, yeah, we're proud of that.
Now let's start with the 160th anniversary of The Nation. Let's talk about the founding of The Nation, how it came to be, and how that connects to the moment today, because you deal with that in your editorial for the latest edition of The Nation. I think it was called This Disunited States is the sort of theme
These,
of the issue.
yeah,
These
these
dis-
di these disunited states, which is in itself a kind of meta bit because in the 1920s, The Nation published a series of articles by then the leading intellectuals in the country. So H.L. Mencken, W.E.B. Du Bois, people like that, called These United States, which was essentially a response to the growing, and this was the 1920s, remember, homogenization of American culture and the idea that as America was becoming a more urban society, as it was becoming more of a mass media society, regional and state differences were being lost, and they wanted to kind of take an inventory on the ground before that happened. So that was the 1920s. And then in the 1970s, John Leonard, who was then the literary editor of The Nation, kind of revived this concept and published a few pieces in the magazine, but many more of them as a book under the title These United States. And again, it was long essays from each state. Now, Katrina vanden Heuvel, who's The Nation's editorial director and publisher, she and I worked together on the 150th anniversary issue 10 years earlier. And that really was a kind of year-long project of putting together, lots of historical pieces and having contemporary writers comment on previous writers. that was, a 50, as it were, every 50-year project. This is we're celebrating 160, and we wanted to celebrate it, but we didn't quite have the resources or the time to do it that way. So what we decided to do instead was write to or reach out to 50 of the leading writers and artists, one for each state. And in that task, I was very much aided by Richard Kreitner, who was on the 150th, my assistant, and has now become a distinguished writer in his own right. In fact, he's just published a book called Fear No Pharaoh about American Jews in the Civil War. Anyway, he and I reached out to writers in every state and were delighted and sometimes surprised by the alacrity with which people said yes, they would give us. Now, these are shorter pieces. These are, a few hundred words. Very few of them go over 1,000 words. So this is not a doorstop of an issue, really, but it's a double issue. It's a special double issue, and this section is probably about as long as the whole magazine would be most issues. And yeah, we've got some great names in there and some great prose and some great pieces of art. Um, I put it that way because one of my favorite contributions is from Judy Chicago, and it's essentially a tapestry, and it's called "We're All in the Same Boat."
So, if you could, your editorial in this edition of The Nation talks about its founding moment in 1865, and you discuss Frederick Law Olmsted's vision for an honest weekly newspaper and the editor E.L. Godkin's commitment to greater accuracy in reporting. Can you relate uh, those sort of origins to where we're at now and how the
Sure.
nation has evolved and its importance today in an age of, Elon Musk and disinformation and all kinds of craziness?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. So the nation was Frederick Law Olmsted's invention, like Central Park and a lot of New York City water supply and a lot of other parks around the country. This we originated in the fertile mind of this polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted, who came up with the idea actually in 1863 at a time when, as I write in the editorial, the question of whether a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long endure was actually a live question. In other words, the Confederate Army had just won victories at Chancellorsville and Winchester in Virginia, and the fortunes of the Union were not particularly bright at that time. And he assembled a team of backers at the Union League Club in New York, which is always kind of funny because the Union League Club is still there, and it's very much an establishment Republican organization. I remember writing to them when we were celebrating our 150th, asking if they wanted to host an event, and it was they were very polite about it, but clearly they had no more sympathy for our ideas. Anyway, uh, partly because he was such a polymath, Olmsted was soon distracted by the offer of managing a gold mine in California and eventually being the secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a precursor to the American Red Cross, and it dealt with essentially health and healing for wounded soldiers. Um, so he passed the idea and the money he'd raised along to E.L. Godkin, who was a Irish-born, Northern Irish-born journalist who'd come to the country and, in fact, had emulated something Olmsted had done, which is Olmsted had toured the South on horseback for the New York Times in the late 1850s. And when Godkin arrived in 1860, he followed in Olmsted's footsteps literally and wrote to him, and they became friends, which is why Olmsted recruited him for this magazine. So by 1865, when the first issue of The Nation came out, July 6th, 1865 to be exact, um, the Union victory was no longer in doubt, but the nature of what this country would mean and the status, particularly of the African Americans who had been newly freed, many of whom had fought for their own freedom, some of whom had lost their lives for the Union. Their status was still in some sense in question. And the magazine was a vehicle for what was then called radical republicanism, which is to say, people who thought that the victories secured on the battlefield had to be guaranteed through political change. So the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, these were all radical Republican propositions. And they passed through Congress essentially because in the South, the Democratic voters who would have elected senators and congressmen who would have vetoed them were disenfranchised because they just participated in a rebellion. Now, the radical Republicans also believed that you had to earn your way back to citizenship, not that it should be given as a blanket pardon the way Andrew Johnson did. And so they were very actively engaged in, as it were, domestic conflict from the very first issue of the magazine. And they were very clear about which side they were on. But they were also very clear that the nation charged a nickel at a time when most magazines charged 3 cents and most newspapers were charging a penny. Um, and the idea was not to get a huge audience, but to get an audience that had influence and to sway public opinion by swaying elite opinion. Now, I hope we've become less elitist in in the succeeding 160 years, but this was a magazine that, Henry James wrote for often, his father wrote for, his brother wrote for. Uh, this is a magazine that the great philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce, the founder of American pragmatism, made a living writing book reviews for. Um, so there was, it had a strong cultural element, and it was strongly engaged on the radical Republican side, which is to say the side of equal political rights for blacks and whites. Um, but it also had, underneath all of that, as it were, a very deep faith that the way to sway public opinion was not through heated rhetoric, but by telling people the truth. And that the most radical thing you can do as a journalist is to tell the truth.
If
And
we
I think
could,
that's the part that I would say is the through line that connects us to our current stance and our current project. I mean, we could talk all day about this, and I'd be delighted to, but your listeners may not. I wrote the history of the nation. It's a book called The Nation, a biography, the first 150 years. And in that book, I trace the way that directly after the Civil War, when the movement for an 8-hour day arose, which, by the way, Karl Marx, writing in the New York Herald, called the first fruits of the Civil War, meaning that now that factory workers had fought for the Union, they were prepared to fight to free themselves of their own forms of slavery and exploitation. But that movement frightened many of the Northern industrialists who had financed and supported the nation. And so, in a way, although the nation did not fully abandon the cause of racial justice, it certainly started to downplay it pretty much at the time when Rutherford Hayes won was made president over Samuel Tilden, even though Tilden had more votes. And it responded very badly to the wave of strikes that struck the country in the 1860s and 1870s and moved very far to the right. So it remained, as it were, the organ of the Republican Party through this period. But the Republican Party itself started to move to the right during this period, and the nation, as it were, both led and followed it. So I would argue that there are two through lines in the history of the magazine over the past 150 years. One is in the 1870s and 1880s, when some Republicans were urging the United States to conquer, like when Theodore Roosevelt, who hated the nation, which returned the favor in spades, by the way, when he was pushing for the Spanish-American War, the nation was on the side of Mark Twain and those who warned against the Spanish-American War and warned against the conquest of the Philippines as the first real betrayal of the ideas that had motivated the American Revolution and had motivated the Philippine revolutionaries who were then engaged in slaughtering. So that's one through line. The second through line throughout is that while our interpretation of situations may have changed and moved first to the right and then back over the 20th century to the left, the continuity in a commitment to transparent reporting of the facts and to not watering the facts down and to not sugaring the pill and to telling our readers the truth has remained.
It's interesting you mentioned the war with Spain. I was looking over old issues of The Nation today, and one that caught my eye was an editorial that E.L. Godkin wrote called War or Peace, I believe in 1898, where he took aim at the yellow journalists who basically brought our country into that war. And it led me to want to ask you about the nation's relationship with opposing sort of imperial hubris and American expansionism.
Well, I'm so glad you asked because there's a brilliant essay in the 160th anniversary issue that's not part of These Disunited States package. It's by Viet Thanh Nguyen, the novelist. Uh, and it's called Greater America. And it's about essentially it's one of the most brilliant pieces I've ever published. And it was a joy to work on. But it has what is on the surface a very transparent structure, but once you sort of get into it, it's not difficult to read, but you realize that it's structurally brilliant because it has a series of doubles and mirror images. And just to pick on two of them, he tells his story as the child of refugees from communism, but also, as it were, people whose family were caught up in America's war overseas to prevent communism. And then he talks about Marco Rubio, another child of refugees from communism whose family came to the U.S. from Cuba, um, and how it's almost like quarks spinning off in different directions. Viet spun left and Rubio spun right, but the motivating shock was the same. And the other double he talks about, and this is in some ways more germane to your question, is Greater America, which he describes as this kind of murderous doppelganger of the United States of America. The United States of America is the country and the idea of a country based on the belief that all men are created equal, that everybody has unalienable rights, that there should be that you have a right to due process, that nobody should be, bullied by the state. And then Greater America is the idea that because we are a successful country, we have the right to spread our ideology, our culture, and our commerce all over the world, and that anybody who stands in our way is evil. And, that in a way is a brilliant modern updating and reinvocation of the same ideals that were motivating people like Godkin and Twain in the 1890s when they were opposing U.S. imperialism just as it was being hatched.
In that regard, how important is that for the nation, that history of opposing, um, imperialism? How important do you think that is to the nation's history? And then I want to get into I.F. Stone, but I really wanted to pinpoint on this because I think it's relevant to the moment.
I think it's hugely important. I mean, look, if you look at the current landscape, let's just take, for example, the New Republic. There are times when the nation and the New Republic have been quite Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And maybe this is one of them. I mean, Michael Tomasky is a friend of mine. He was a nation intern in the 80s. And I think he's more liberal and we're more radical. But, there's a kind of once Trump got elected, the sort of competition among the kind of anti-Trumpian forces intensified, and I think that's a good thing. It may be difficult for us as a business proposition, but politically it's a good thing. But I would say that to me, and I know to Katrina vanden Heuvel, my predecessor, and to Victor Navasky, her predecessor, the nation's heritage of questioning and being skeptical of American expansionism and the idea that America's exceptionalism entitles it to wage war on the rest of the world is just probably the most important part of the nation's heritage. And I would say that if you're now, that doesn't mean that the next editor of the nation will feel this way, but I think it's pretty important that anybody who edits this magazine does feel that way because it's what it's what gives you a moral compass without having to start without having to prove every proposition from first principles. And I think it's what allowed, for example, Katrina to steer the magazine through the Iraq War when everybody else was going the other way. It's hard to stand up when everybody else is going in the other direction. It's hard to say no when you're being denounced as not just unpatriotic, but a traitor after 9/11 for not supporting, going to war with Iran, going to war with Iraq. And what is it that gives you that strength to stand? I think history can do that. Now, I would say that because I'm the editor not just of a 160-year-old magazine, but also by formation a historian. And I think that if you have a sense of history and at the nation, if we have a sense of our history, that's an enormously valuable thing for us.
I'm curious. So in your anniversary editorial, you quote Olmsted's faith in simply telling people the truth. I know that a lot of people now are questioning the public's ability to act on truth in a disinformation saturated age. I think the nation still believes in the public's ability to act on truth despite the disinformation and misinformation we see. Can you speak to that?
I think if you don't believe in that and you're a journalist, you're in the wrong line of work. I mean, I think that's now that doesn't mean that I view the truth in the same way as, I don't know, somebody who writes for Unheard or the National Review. There's my my first postgraduate degree was in English literature, so I'm not totally immune to the temptations of postmodernism and the view that there's more than one way to view the truth or to interpret a set of facts. I think there probably is, but I think you can still have agreed facts, and you need those to start, and you need to have, as the public, you need to have media that you can trust. And part of trust is not to pretend to be impartial. That's the thing that always drove me crazy about mainstream journalism. I mean, I tell our younger writers and our reporters,
Real quick, what's that line that I think it was Howard Zinn that said, you can't be neutral on a moving train?
well, that's probably true. I mean, and I have a lot more sympathy for Howard Zinn and a lot more admiration than I do for Daniel Patrick Moynihan. But Moynihan said you can have your own interpretation, but you can't have your own facts. And I think both of those things are true. Um, and in a way, I mean, in my career, my first book was about a libel trial where somebody was suing a woman who called him a Holocaust denier because he said that the Holocaust had never happened.
Right, this is
And
the Deborah Lipstadt. Yeah.
Deborah Lipstadt, David Irving. And, in a way, the Holocaust is kind of a limit case for postmodernism. A lot of postmodern, it's like, there are no pacifists in foxholes, and there are very few postmodernists when they come up against the Holocaust. And I think that's a good thing, but in a way, it exposes the poverty of their theory, which I suppose is one reason why I abandoned literary theory for history. Because, you know, it's very important to understand that, yes, you can disagree about interpretations, motivations, significance, frameworks, but some things just happened and some things are happening, and unless you can tell people the truth about what's actually happening and perhaps what happened in the past to help make sense of it, then what are you doing? You might as well be, I don't know, designing video games. Not that that's an ignoble pursuit, but it's not the same thing as journalism.
When I butted in with that comment about Howard Zinn, I think I may have cut you off for making a very interesting point about um, a lot of people will talk about objectivity in journalism, but
Ah,
I think what's important is we have to tackle that question in an interesting way, I think, because what is it and what isn't it? What is objectivity and what isn't? Because I think some people get confused over that.
I think
Sometimes. Mhm.
that's a great question. That's a great question. And yeah, when you came, when you said that about Howard Zinn, I was about to say that there's a phrase I say to my staff probably at least once a week, which is, we're not the New York Times, we take sides. And so I think part of what objectivity is for mainstream journalists, uh, which I do not consider myself, is that they take great pains not to be seen to taking sides, which is, of course, not the same thing as not taking sides. So I think part of
Real
object,
quick, I guess what I was trying to get at with, and you've hit upon it, there is, in a way, sometimes I think people that say they're being journalistically objective can end up being people that are kind of just covering for the quote unquote status quo.
absolutely. Yeah, no, I think not taking sides is taking a side. I think pretending not to take sides is usually just a rationale for the status quo. So is both sidesism, since usually the powerful side is in power. And if you're just always treating every story as if it has both two sides and you have to be equally fair to both, then essentially you're just consolidating power. Now, if you're a cheerleader for power, fine, say so, do it, own it. But, we're not here at the nation. And I think for me, objectivity is very different from transparency, honesty, or candor, all of which I think are very important. I think it's very important to be transparent about where you stand, what you stand for, and where you start from. And I think those are things that readers or listeners or viewers have a right to know about any medium that they are consulting to try and understand the world. And to mystify where you stand, to deny that you have a point of view, to me that's dishonest. Whereas if you say, we're a left publication, so do not expect us to be sympathetic to Donald Trump, but even a broken clock is right twice a day. And if this is one of those broken clock moments, as for example, I thought his reluctance to get involved in foreign wars was a broken clock moment. It's being tested this week. We'll see. But then you should say so. And saying so doesn't mean that you're in Trump's pocket. It doesn't mean you're a stooge. And it doesn't mean that you've abandoned your principles. But it does mean that you can tell your readers the truth, and that sometimes the truth is complex.
There's two more things I want to talk about regarding the nation, and then I do want to talk about I.F. Stone, but there's so much
Good.
with the nation we could talk about. But
That's
you
fine.
know, you mentioned in the editorial the both the depredations of Elon Musk, all this Doge stuff, and the failures of democratic leadership. So we're seeing these sort of crises on every front in America right now. How do you decide what the nation prioritizes editorially when there's so many crises that we're facing all at once?
Yeah, well, I wake up every morning with Dorothy Parker's words in my head, what fresh hell is this? Because there's fresh hell every day. Um, I don't know. It changes from day to day. I mean, if partly we are both trying to change the world and to interpret it. So we're not Karl Marx. We're not just trying to change the world. We are trying to interpret it. We are trying to help people make sense of it, in part so they can change it, but in part just so they can understand it. And some days there's something you can say which might make an impact about, for example, Donald Trump's corruption. Some days there's something you can say about Chuck Schumer's fecklessness or the total corporate domination of the Democratic Party and what that means in terms of who it backs, who it doesn't back, who it sells out, and why we can't have not just good things, but decent policies. You know, in other words, why can't we have the things that Bernie Sanders ran on? Why can't we have universal health care for all? Why can't we have higher education that doesn't send people into a lifetime of debt? Well, we can't have those things because the people who fund the Democratic Party don't want us to have them. And we're in a system where we only have two parties and which is designed to really keep any other party from emerging. The last successful party that emerged in this country was the Republican Party that emerged with the help of the nation in the 19th century. Um, right now we have two parties, and the Democratic Party, has two wings, but one of those wings only wants to fly when it's winning. And that's not a recipe for success or for progressive change.
You mentioned co-editing the 150th anniversary issue with Richard Kreitner, and now closing out your tenure with him on the 160th. What have you learned from him and from mentoring younger writers? Because I think you would have a lot to say about the future when it comes to these young journalists.
Well, I think the main thing I've learned from working with Richard and other young journalists is humility. That it's very easy to think, particularly when you've been in this business. I mean, I wrote my first piece for The Nation in 1979. I got paid $50. It was a book review. Um, when you've been in it for a long time, you think you've seen it all, and you forget sometimes what it's like to look with a fresh pair of eyes and how important that can be. The literary editor actually who just died, Betsy Pacoda, who published me in the 70s, gave me a chance to write about topics that I didn't know that much about, but that I was incredibly curious about. And I think I've learned, I've been reminded what a great policy that is as an editor, to not always defer to expertise, to sometimes allow people who can write well and who are just enthusiastic and curious to have a go at a tough issue. And maybe they won't come up with the orthodox solution or the commonly accepted progressive approach. Maybe they'll come up with something nobody else has thought of, or maybe, God forbid, they'll have heretical thoughts. Um, but but we should be encouraging that. We should always be a heretical journal. So I've learned that uh, from Richard himself. He's a wonderful historian, and here's a very specific example. He wrote a book about secession and the history of American secession movements. And at the time, I was very dubious. And I'm still kind of dubious, even though, secession on the left is always popular when the right is in power, just like secession on the right was popular when Obama was in office. But if you look in the 160th, you'll see I wrote the piece about New York State, and my article for New York State is essentially about New York City, and it advocates secession, meaning that New York City should secede from New York State, because all of these people who are now running for mayor have a lot of great ideas, but none of them are going to be able to be put into practice unless they get permission and money from Albany, which is in most cases unlikely. So, I've learned to from Richard in particular, to think anew about questions that I thought were settled. And I think that's something that younger contributors can always bring to the nation.
So we got to get into I.F. Stone now because I
Okay.
love your book, American Radical. It's been a number of years since I read it, but it was influential on me when I was going through high school and my early years of college. I.F. Stone is a big inspiration for me. But if I have listeners that don't know who I.F. Stone is, how would you maybe give an outline of his career and its importance today?
Sure. Well, there are a few ways to describe Stone, and I suspect most of your listeners won't know who he is. That was part of my problem when writing the biography. Is I started in the 80s when he was a household name, but I didn't finish until the 2000s, and by then most people who knew who he was were dead. Um, so one way to think of him is as the first blogger, because he was a radical journalist, and my book is called American Radical because, in a way, his life was the story of the American left in the 20th century, and that was a story I very much wanted to tell as a historian. And he was kind of the Zelig of the American left, in that wherever there was a left fight, I.F. Stone was in the thick of it. From the Palmer raids and the rise of the Socialist Party in the 1920s to the Depression and the rise of the Popular Front and the American Communist Party in the 30s to uh, the rise of trade unionism in the end of the 30s, and then the New Deal and the whole, New Deal enterprise and the idea that federal government could be a massive force for good, and then the Cold War. And the Cold War turned him into a leper, a pariah. He couldn't get work. And so he started his own newsletter, I.F. Stone's Weekly, and really, that was that second act to his life, because his first act had been very successful. He'd been the youngest editorial writer on the New York Post. He had access. He could walk into the White House and put his feet up on the president's assistant's desk. And, you know, he was not a total outsider in the first stage of his career. He was very much an insider during FDR's administration. But afterwards, when the kind of Cold War froze off a lot of that kind of energy, he became not just an outsider, but a pariah. And so he started this thing, I.F. Stone's Weekly, which he ran himself out of his house with his wife as his only other, as it were, staff. She ran the business side. He wrote everything. It was 4 pages, sometimes 6 pages. It came out every week. It cost $5 a year. And once he got 5,000 subscribers, which took about 18 months, it paid it gave him a living. And when he shut up shop in 1971, he had 70,000 subscribers. He was making enough money to put his 3 children through expensive colleges and go on nice vacations, and he had a decent pension. So, he was successful in American terms. But what was particularly, I think, wonderful about him was that he was not just an indefatigable investigative reporter, of whom there are not nearly enough around, um, but also an investigative reporter who can write. And I have to say, as somebody who did my share of editing investigative reporters, not just here, but at the Village Voice in the 80s, and did a little bit of investigative reporting myself at New York Newsday in the 90s. Being able to write is an enormous asset for a journalist, but for an investigative reporter, it is less important than being able to find the material, find your way through the archives, look at the court records, track down the documents, and get people to talk to you. So the fact that he could do all those things made him very important as a journalist, and particularly during the Vietnam War, when he was the single most trusted source by the anti-war movement.
Yeah,
So,
wasn't he one of the only ones to challenge LBJ's account of the Gulf of Tonkin?
pardon?
Wasn't he one of the only journalists to really challenge
He was
LBJ's
the,
account of Gulf of Tonkin?
he was the only journalist to challenge it in real time. In other words, LBJ convinced the whole country that there had been an attack on American shipping in the Gulf of Tonkin. And as it happened, and I don't know whether you know this, I made a radio documentary about this for the BBC called War Lies on Audio Tape, which came out on the 50th anniversary of the Gulf of Tonkin. But I.F. Stone was the only, and part of the reason I did that and was able to do that is because I had spent a lot of time researching Stone's role as the only person to get the truth out about the Gulf of Tonkin when it was happening.
Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Can you speak more to how does Stone become the only person that was questioning it in real time? That's always fascinated me, and I think my listeners would be very interested to know.
Well, so okay, this you asked, so I'm going to tell you, but it's going to take a little explaining. So, first of all, I.F. Stone was somebody who had been the nation's Washington correspondent, and I guess we should mention that because it does tie the two halves of this podcast together. He'd been the nation's Washington correspondent from 1939 to 1945 when he was fired because he went underground to Palestine with the Jewish refugees from Europe for the newspaper PM, which was a left-wing tabloid in New York, where he was a columnist. And he was working both for PM and for The Nation. And he told his PM editor, because he was writing front page stories every day once he was at sea, but he didn't tell Frida Kirchway, the editor of The Nation, where he was going or what he was doing. So she fired him. Anyway, during that period, he had had a front row seat in terms of how Washington works, how the foreign policy establishment works, how the White House works, how the Pentagon bureaucracy works. He'd written a whole book about military contracting during World War II. So, he knew basically how Washington worked. That's one thing. Then, when he was abroad during the late 40s, because he spent 2 years living outside the United States, in part because he was afraid that if he came back, he'd get arrested. And he never got arrested, but he did have the FBI come and question him, try and take his passport away. And they spent 2 years wiretapping him and going through his garbage. So, they never charged him with anything. But as he was being blacklisted, he was also being harassed by the FBI continually. Um, but during that period, while he was abroad, he uh, he got to know a journalist called Bernard Fall. And Bernard Fall had been a U.S. veteran. He was uh, a Jew who was either the son of refugees or was himself a refugee. Anyway, he spoke fluent French, and he had fought beside and then had spent time in Vietnam while the French were fighting in Vietnam. And Fall later came and became an academic who wrote about Vietnam and East Asia. He was a scholar. He was a kind of soldier scholar, and he was a friend of Stone's. And Fall had written about why the French project was doomed in Vietnam. And also, when Stone was living outside the country, he was living in Paris. Well, France was the imperial power that we took over from in Vietnam. So, in other words, he had a much better sense of the reality on the ground in Vietnam, even in 1959, than, for example, John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson or, for that matter, William Westmoreland. Um, then there's the fact that he was publishing this newsletter, and that meant that people leaked to him. So there would be, people in the Pentagon who would leak to him. There would be people in the State Department who would leak to him. And then the final thing is that in 1965, Stone went himself to Vietnam to report. He went there for a month. And so, he saw things with his own eyes. He saw how badly the war was going, just as Westmoreland was saying, oh, we're going to wrap it up in 6 months. You know, famously after the Tet invasion, after the Tet offensive, Stone wrote that when the White House was trying to paint this as a victory, and if you look at revisionist histories of Vietnam, in some ways you could argue that because in some ways after Tet, the U.S. started to do better on the battlefield. But of course, they were doing better on the battlefield because the Viet Cong had withdrawn from, they'd made their point. They decimated South Vietnamese military. They'd made clear that nowhere in Vietnam, north or south, was beyond their reach or influence. They'd made it clear to the Americans that there was no safe harbor in the country. And then they withdrew. But, that still allowed, because the U.S. was able to occupy territory again and seemed to be prevailing in some combat instances, they said that they were winning. And Stone said, with more victories like Tet, we'd be lucky to settle for neutrality for Hawaii. You know, I mean, in other words, he could see what was happening. Now, why couldn't anybody else see what was happening? Well, people did. Michael Herr started to see what was happening. There were Harrison Salisbury went to Vietnam and reported honestly what was happening. But Stone could see it in 63 because he'd followed the French and he'd followed their war, and he realized that our war, although it had more money, it had fewer troops initially, it had more money, but it wasn't going any better than their war for the same reason, which, as he said, is because you can't win a war in a Buddhist peasant country by fighting on the side of the Catholic landlords.
If you could stay a little bit longer, I did want to ask about Stone and the way he was blacklisted during the McCarthyite witch hunts and how he he was critical of McCarthyism. He took it on. So can you speak to that? Because I think it's important today. I think there's a lot of political witch hunting today.
I think there's a lot of political witch hunting today, but I also think it's important, particularly, and this is why I think Stone is newly relevant. So it's why I was particularly delighted to get your invitation. He used the word McCarthyism, but the term he preferred was Trumanism. And the reason for that is because the Red Scare began when Truman tried to neutralize, as he called it, the communist issue by outflanking the Republican Party on the right and issuing his loyalty order. And the loyalty order essentially unleashed a purge of all of the most committed left wing officials and bureaucrats in Washington. In other words, the kind of thing that would have been, for example, there was a group called the League of Women Shoppers. Now, the League of Women Shoppers was a consumerist organization when Ralph Nader was still wearing diapers. It was decades ahead of his time, and it was led by women. And a lot of those women had jobs inside the Commerce Department or, other New Deal agencies. Some of them had positions of power. And they were basically saying, corporations dominate American manufacturing and our economy, and consumers need to be organized to push back for their rights. It was a radical idea whose time is still coming. But the people who did that, some of them did it. Some of them had been members of the Communist Party in the 30s. Some of them remained members of the Communist Party in the 40s. A lot of people, like, for example, I.F. Stone, was never a member of the Communist Party, but he was what he would have called a fellow traveler in the 30s. He was very supportive, for example, of the American Communist Party's role in American politics. He was very supportive of the Soviet Union as a, ally against fascism. Of course, what totally torpedoed that stance was the Hitler-Stalin Pact, and that was the point at which Stone ceased to be a fellow traveler and denounced it. In other words, he didn't keep quiet about it. He said, "This is garbage." You can't say that whether or not the Russians have a right to seize pieces of Poland is a matter of taste. It's not a matter of taste. It's a matter of justice and equity. And if you shut up about it, you're a hypocrite. And he said that. He was very clear about it. But he also felt like there's a war on, and you can't always vet your allies, and expect them all to agree with you on everything. And particularly, he also thought there was a war on in America for greater economic justice, for racial justice, for rights for women, for rights for immigrants, for rights for workers. And he was willing to judge people on what they did in those struggles and their roles in those struggles. And for that matter, so certainly was Eleanor Roosevelt, who was involved in a lot of these organizations, and her husband Franklin. Harry Truman was not. He did not have the guts to stand up for people who'd been left wing when they were unionists. Now, he did try to veto the Taft-Hartley Act, which was the Republican-led effort to purge the unions of anybody who was left wing. But the fatal flaw of the New Deal coalition was that it relied on the votes of racist Southern Democrats to keep the Democrats in power in Congress and in the White House. So Franklin Roosevelt could not go too far on racial justice. He had to be pushed to do whatever he did. Harry Truman also had to be pushed to do whatever he did. Luckily, the leadership of the civil rights movement in those days had men of genius and women of genius like Constance Baker Motley who knew how to push. And they pushed so that they issued, Harry Truman desegregated the armed forces. Anyway, this is a long way of saying that the purge and the sort of ideological litmus tests that marginalized the most vibrant segments of the American left in the 1940s were pioneered by Democrats and then, of course, totally weaponized by Republicans. Now, does that sound like what we've seen today? To some of us, it's eerily familiar, yeah. Does it sound like what happened, for example, to, Bernie Sanders in 2020 when the corporate leaders of the Democratic Party decided he was doing too well and had to be, and Obama summoned the troops to stop him? Yes, to me it sounds like that. Absolutely. Does that mean that, we're in bed with Trump or that we want to go waste our time and our energy with Jill Stein? No, it does not. But it does mean we should be realistic about who our allies are in any given fight.
I also wanted to ask you about the FBI file on IF. So it's so juicy. Everyone, when they hear like, "Oh my God, the FBI surveilled this figure," everyone wants to know about that. So, what did you learn from the FBI file and the surveillance of IF Stone?
Well, I'll tell it in reverse in a way because I got, so I requested I.F. Stone's FBI file in July of 1989. He died in June of 1989. I didn't get the last release until 2005. So the wheels of freedom of information turn very slowly. However, I did get a letter back fairly soon saying, well, there are 6,000 pages in his file, so it's going to take us a while to get to them. Now, you have to realize that Al Capone's FBI file was less than half that long. So 6,000 pages is a lot. And I didn't know then, and I wouldn't know for another 15 years why. I can tell you now, and that's what I mean by I'm going to start at the end. The reason is because in the 1940s, when the US was decoding the KGB's ciphers, they came upon references in some KGB traffic from Washington to an agent called Blin, which is the Russian word for pancake, like blintz or blini, blin. And there was some thought that Blin might be I.F. Stone. And there's a whole controversy about this, which we don't have time to get into, but which, if you're interested in, it's in my book. Um, Whether or not Blin ever was I.F. Stone, I.F. Stone was never a communist. He was never a Soviet agent. And he was surveyed for 2 years by a man who hated him, J. Edgar Hoover, who called him names in the, like he's a snake, he's a scum. There was another leak from the FBI that one FBI person said to Hoover, "The only person who can tell us who's leaking this is I.F. Stone. Should we interview him?" And Hoover said, "By no means talk to that snake." So Hoover hated him, and if Hoover
Yeah,
could have
Hoover
got,
disliked a lot of people, but it seemed like he had a
he
special
re-
hatred for Stone.
he really hated Stone. And if he could have gotten anything on him or put him in jail, believe me, he would have been delighted to do so. So he couldn't and he didn't, but he sure tried. And tried included things like what's called a mail cover, which means they open your mail and then they close it again so you can't tell. A trash cover, meaning that the agents go through your garbage cans. They did that for almost a year for I.F. Stone. And they wired his, they tapped his phones. And the phone taps were the last pieces of the file to be released because this was completely illegal. There was no warrant. There was no he had no reason to tap Stone's phones, but he did. And what he found out was he found some conversations with Stone's brother-in-law, the lawyer Leonard Boudin, who was defending some of the people that the FBI was trying to lock up or take their passports away. And that was those recordings were illegal. They were illegal for Hoover to have. They were illegal for the FBI to have. And of course, Hoover was leaking things like this all the time to McCarthy. That was that's the kind of hidden story of McCarthyism, although it comes out a little bit in Kai Bird's biography of Robert Oppenheimer, and it even comes out a little bit in the movie that it wasn't that McCarthy was doing this investigating himself or that the House committees were doing investigating themselves. They had investigators, but really what they were doing were getting material leaked from the FBI. So we had a fascist police state. We just didn't know it at the time.
I just think it's such an important aspect of the story because we see what is being done to dissidents today, especially under the sort of Trump administration. I just had two more questions. I know we're running up against the hour.
Sure.
I just wanted to briefly touch on I.F. Stone's relationship with Israel-Palestine. He had a very interesting view, and he was there for it. He did direct
Oh yeah.
reporting. And I think he
Yeah.
also took a view that was kind of ahead of its time in the sense that I think he really felt for Palestinians while also feeling strongly about Israelis. And my understanding was always that he ended up supporting a sort of a binational solution. Whether one agrees with that or not, I mean, it's really interesting his sort of evolution on
I
Israel-Palestine.
I would say it's fascinating, and in a way, it was what gave me a second wind writing the biography because it was kind of a revelation to me. I mean, I'd known him as an investigative reporter, a muckraker, and an anti-Vietnam War, source of information, but I didn't really know that much about his, as it turned out, complete immersion in the whole history of the Zionist movement and the state of Israel from the basically from the mid 1940s or the early 1940s onwards. I mean, Stone was not a Zionist in his youth. He was not, he was Jewish and he had a bar mitzvah and his parents were religious. He was not religious. Um, and he was not a Zionist, he was a socialist. But after the revelation of what had happened in the Second World War, and it wasn't for him a distant thing, he went to the Nuremberg trials. He reported from the Nuremberg trials. He then went to displaced persons camps and interviewed Holocaust survivors, and they all told him the same thing. None of them wanted to go back home to Poland or Germany, where their neighbors either had betrayed them or thought or might still kill them. They wanted to go to Palestine. That's where they wanted to go. And so he decided he would go with them. And he was not just on this ship as part of this journey. He was also very connected to what was called the Aliyah Bet, the secret illegal immigration to Palestine that began in 1939. Some of those leaders met in his house. Some of those ships were outfitted, by people he knew and who he solicited money from. His son told me he heard them talking about how to put bombs in cars, in British cars at the dinner table at their house. So, this was not he was not at a distance from this. He was right in it. And he got to Palestine on a ship that could have been like the St. Louis, could have been turned away. As it happened, it got to Palestine, but everybody had to get off in Cyprus, and they had typhus on the ship, and Stone was interned for a while. Um, and then he went back to Israel in 48 to cover the war under fire. He did that for the New Republic. So he was in the room when the Declaration of Israeli Independence was signed. I mean, you could not have a better seat to the early history of the state than Stone. And he covered all of its wars up to the Suez War in the 50s. And the Suez War really kind of got to him because that was a war where Israel teamed up with Britain and France to try and seize the Suez Canal. Um, and essentially, Eisenhower forced them to stop. Eisenhower basically threatened to cause a run on the British pound if the British didn't stop. And he did not support the Israelis in this war. He supported a negotiated peace. And Stone realized a couple of things. First of all, he realized that Israel was becoming a kind of eager apprentice to imperialist powers. And secondly, he realized that he'd been closing his eyes this whole time to the existence of this other people, the Palestinians. And he stopped closing his eyes. And once he stopped closing his eyes in 57, he never closed them again. And in 67, he wrote a piece for the New York Review of Book called The Other Zionism, which was essentially about what he called cultural Zionism, which was the pre 48 strand of Zionism that Judah Magnus, who was the head of the Hebrew University, Martin Buber,
I
a
was going
lot
to
of
mention Buber. Buber is a big influence on me, actually.
great 20th century Jewish intellectuals, Hannah Arendt for that matter, had embraced this. They had a group called Ehud, which means unity, and the unity they saw it was unity with the Palestinians. It was not for a political Zionism, but for a Jewish cultural renaissance inside a democratic, non-sectarian state in historical Palestine. That's what they wanted. Now, after Israel was a reality, Stone always was very protective of Israel's right to exist, especially because, as he knew very well and reported, it was filled with people for whom there was ein brera, the Hebrew phrase meaning no alternative. They had nowhere else to go.
Right.
So,
But at the same time, he never, I don't think he ever treated Arabs in a racist or dehumanizing way. And he didn't treat Palestinians in that dehumanizing way
well,
either.
I would say his coverage of the War of 48 was not, it was not racist, but the Arabs were the enemy. They were killing people he knew and cared about. And he covered the war, and he covered them as an enemy army. He did not spend time, for example, behind Arab lines in 48, and he did not spend a lot of time. I can't recall offhand, and I'm not being evasive. I just generally can't recall what he wrote about Deir Yassin at the time. But that was not his focus. His focus is will this embattled state survive in 48? And that was his focus until 56, when it was clear that Israel was militarily superior to all of its neighbors, and that it was time to make peace with the people who it had pushed aside in order to survive. And that remained his
Well,
view
that's
to
what
the
I
end of life.
meant. There is a recognition by him of the humanity of the Palestinians at that point in time. Yeah.
Yeah, I would certainly say from the 50s, which, if you're a Palestinian, there's no reason you have to be grateful for that. But on the other hand, it was so far ahead of anybody else. And he paid for it. He paid for it a lot. I mean, for example, in 56, a guy wrote a piece in the New Republic reviewing a collection of his from the 50s called Martin Peretz. And Peretz asked whether Stone had offered a pastorate for oppression, was the phrase he used, meaning, was he a cover up or a shill for dictatorships? And Peretz said clearly not. But by 1969, when Peretz is the owner and publisher of the New Republic and doing everything he can to suppress any mention of the Palestinians or their cause, Stone was the enemy again and a leper. So, as it were, he became a pariah twice, once over his American politics and once over his politics in the Middle East.
Very last question. I promise to let you go after this, but before we started recording, we were talking a little bit. I was very influenced growing up reading the old works of George Seldes. I was a weird kid reading George Seldes at my age, but I wanted to talk about what's the relationship between George Seldes and I.F. Stone. They may not have necessarily collaborated
Oh no,
closely, but they both.
they had a very clear relationship, which I trace in American Radical, which is, and that's why I interviewed Seldes. Seldes lived in Heartland Corners, Vermont, and I went to see him when he was 103. Um, and the reason I went to see him is because Seldes had published his own one-man newsletter called In Fact when he became, well, he wasn't blacklisted. Seldes was never blacklisted, but he was a kind of star columnist for right-wing papers, the Hearst papers, and for the New York Post in the 1930s. He was their Italy correspondent. He covered Mussolini. He interviewed Mussolini many times. So he had, as it were, a front row seat to the rise of fascism. Um, but his politics were too left wing to keep writing for those kind of papers. And in the early days of the AFL-CIO, when we had a well organized, well funded, ambitious union movement, essentially they bankrolled this newsletter, in fact, which he produced, which was, for example, the first newsletter to publish the evidence that smoking causes cancer, which no mainstream newspaper was going to publish because they were all dependent on cigarette advertising. So anyway, so Seldes was a great muckraker, uh, in some ways politically less interesting than Stone, but very much in the same line, at least in terms of domestic politics. And Seldes closed, in fact, because the unions were under Taft-Hartley were withdrawing their funding and scaling back, and he gave Stone his mailing list. So I.F. Stone's Weekly is a direct lineal descendant of Seldes's, in fact. They were friends, they knew each other. Now, Seldes said that it was his idea. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think he certainly encouraged Stone very much at a time when not a lot of other people were.
Yeah, they're both part of a tradition of, I would say, independent investigative journalism, ultimately.
Yeah. Well, independent investigative journalism, yeah. I mean, if you had to look for a modern day version, maybe Seymour Hersh. I would have said Glenn Greenwald, 10 years ago. Um, there it's gotten in some ways easier because the initial capital costs are lower, as you've learned. On the other hand, it's gotten harder because there's a hell of a lot more competition, and also because the sort of general respect for facts has diminished.
To close it all out here, everyone always mentions, whenever you talk about I.F. Stone, for people that are familiar with him, there's that quote he had, all government officials lie. How important do you think that sort of a quote is? Because it's reused so often now, and I think it's very relevant to our time.
Well, I think it's important. I mean, I think the full quote is all governments lie, but disaster lies in wait for those who believe their own lies. Uh, he said various versions of it because he liked to say it, but I think it's important. I think it's true. Um, I think it's also true that that access journalism remains the temptation. I would argue the fatal temptation of mainstream journalists. And as he said, once you've played tennis or had lunch with the Secretary of State, you can't really go after him because he's a great man. So there's a way in which journalists have to learn to remain on the outside. And I think, he's a very salutary reminder of that. But yes, all governments lie. Trump's is not the first government to lie. It's not only Republicans who lie. But he may be, on a scale hitherto unparalleled, a president who believes his own lies and expects his entire administration to act as if they're true.
That's the thing. I kind of wonder what I.F. Stone would think of Donald Trump.
That is kind of terrifying. Yeah.
Well, hey, thank you again, D.D. Guttenplan, for coming on Parallax Views, and I hope we can do this again at some point. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope everyone checks out the 160th anniversary edition of The Nation.
All right. Thank you, JG.
This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Mark M, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, WV, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Darko, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Saded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views. To Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.